The sunlight coming through the kitchen window felt strangely cold that afternoon, even though it was warm outside. I remember standing there with my hands still damp from washing a few dishes, sensing something shift in the air before I even understood why. It was the kind of quiet that tightens around your ribs, the kind that tells you you're about to learn a truth you never asked for. If you've ever trusted someone only to feel the ground move beneath you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from. These moments find all of us eventually. I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything began to unravel. I can still feel the way the air shifted that afternoon, right around 2:30 p.m., when an ordinary day folded in on itself and showed me a truth I wasn't ready to face. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was subtle, almost quiet enough to miss. The kind of moment you only understand once your heart starts piecing together why it suddenly feels heavier. I remember standing there, confused by how quickly trust can tilt, how someone you've spent years believing in can make you question whether the ground under your feet was ever as solid as you thought. What stunned me most wasn't the situation itself, but the realization that it came from a place I never expected. It felt like a small tear at first, something I thought I could brush aside, but as the minutes passed, that tear widened, tugging at memories I had neatly folded away, pulling forward old doubts I thought I had outgrown. I kept replaying the moment, trying to understand how something meant to be simple turned into something that rattled me so deeply. And even then, a part of me knew this wasn't just about today. This was the beginning of a story I'd been circling for years, one I can finally tell. I grew up in a quiet corner of suburban Ohio, the kind of place where people know each other's routines almost as well as their own. My family fit neatly into that rhythm from the outside, but inside our home, things were always a little more complicated. My sister Melissa carried a strong personality that filled every room, while my mom, Linda, spent most of her energy trying to keep the peace without ever really addressing the tension beneath it. Somewhere along the way, I slipped into the role of the steady one, the person who smoothed over rough edges and kept everyone from drifting too far apart. It wasn't a role anyone asked me to take, but it felt like the only way to keep our house from tipping over. I learned early what it meant to swallow frustration, to let comments slide, to stay quiet when my feelings didn't fit the moment. By the time I met Ethan, I didn't even realize how much emotional weight I carried. He often told me I had a calming presence, and I wondered if he'd still think that if he knew how hard I worked to keep things from falling apart. As the years passed, those old family patterns never fully faded. They softened, maybe, but the imbalance lingered. Unspoken expectations, uneven responsibilities, moments where I disappeared into the background because it felt easier than being misunderstood. And even though I built a life outside that house, a part of me always felt pulled back into its familiar gravity. So when that moment happened recently, the one that shook me more than I expected, it didn't just hurt on its own. It stirred everything I thought I had long since settled, reminding me that some wounds don't stay buried just because we want them to. I didn't realize how quickly the past could surface until I decided to do something simple and kind. It started with me wanting to take some of the weight off my parents' shoulders. They've always done so much, and lately I could see the strain catching up with them. So I offered to cover the cost of a small project they'd been putting off, something that would make their everyday life a little easier. It wasn't grand or showy. It just felt right, like a quiet way of giving back for all the years they held things together. But the moment I shared what I intended, I felt the shift. Melissa didn't respond with appreciation or relief. Instead, there was this pause, subtle, sharp, followed by a kind of coolness that left me second-guessing myself. I could almost hear the unspoken judgment, the idea that I was overstepping or trying to make a statement I never intended. Before I even finished explaining my reasons, she had already started reshaping the story in her mind. Over the next day or so, I noticed how quickly her version spread. Little hints reached me through the family grapevine, the kind that carry more weight in how they're said than in the words themselves. Suddenly, my gesture wasn't generous. It was calculated, unnecessary, attention-seeking. At least, that was the tone underneath what I heard. And the more it traveled, the less room I felt I had to correct it. It was like trying to catch smoke with my hands. I kept wondering how something meant with so much sincerity could be twisted into something so foreign to who I am. Each time I replayed the moment in my head, the tension tightened a little more, pulling at old memories of being misunderstood, of having my intentions rewritten by someone else's insecurities. And with every hour that passed, I felt the ground shift again, signaling that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was the beginning of something larger unraveling, something I could no longer ignore. I first realized the story had taken on a life of its own when a cousin reached out with a tone that felt strangely measured, as if they were tiptoeing around something I hadn't been told. It was subtle, but unmistakable, an edge in their politeness, a pause that hadn't been there before. And once I noticed it, I began seeing the same shift in others, a quiet stiffness, a hesitation in their eyes, a kind of collective pulling back, like they were bracing for a version of me I didn't recognize. It didn't take long to piece together what had happened. Melissa's reinterpretation of my gesture had reached them, each retelling sanding away the truth until the story no longer resembled anything I had intended. What hurt wasn't just the distortion itself, but the ease with which people accepted it, the way they filled in the blanks with assumptions that painted me as someone calculating or self-serving. I kept wondering how they could believe it so quickly, and why no one thought to simply ask me what had really happened. The more I sat with it, the more something shifted inside me. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was anger, quiet but sharp, cutting through the disbelief. A part of me had always hoped that misunderstandings were just accidents, the kind that happened when people were too busy or distracted to look closer. But this felt different. This felt chosen. It felt like some of them wanted a reason to see me in a harsher light, wanted a version of the story that confirmed whatever they already believed. That realization stung deeper than anything Melissa had said. And as the weight of it settled, I found myself pulling back, not out of spite, but out of sheer exhaustion. I knew stepping away would only widen the gap, but at that moment, it felt like the only way to protect whatever was left of my peace. Pulling back felt like the only thing I could control. After realizing how far the distorted story had spread, I didn't have the energy to keep defending myself to people who weren't interested in understanding me in the first place. So I stepped back quietly, hoping space might settle things, or at least protect me from the weight of everyone else's assumptions. But the moment I did, the silence was taken as something else entirely. Instead of easing the tension, my distance seemed to harden their view of me. I began noticing decisions being made without me, small family updates that somehow never reached my phone, plans that used to include me slipping by unnoticed. None of it was said out loud, but the message was clear. They were moving on without waiting for my side of the story, and that stung more than the initial misunderstanding. What hurt most was the hope I kept holding on to, the hope that someone, anyone, might reach out with a hint of curiosity, that someone might sense the gap between who I am and who I was being made out to be. But the longer the days stretched, the clearer it became that no one was going to ask. They were content with the version they'd been given, even if it flattened me into something unrecognizable. I found myself caught between wanting peace and wanting to scream my truth, torn by the exhaustion of constantly being misunderstood. Each quiet moment felt heavier, filled with the pressure of everything unsaid. And even though I tried to stay composed, I could feel something building, an undercurrent of frustration and clarity pushing its way to the surface, signaling that the situation was far from over and something bigger was on its way. It wasn't a single moment that gave me clarity. It was a collection of small details, pieces that didn't fit until I finally stopped trying to make sense of them one by one and let them speak together. I started noticing how Melissa reacted whenever I did something thoughtful for our parents, how her eyes sharpened in a way I used to mistake for concern. But this time, with everything already unraveling, I saw something else behind it. Resentment. Almost like my kindness threatened a place she had carefully built for herself. As I sat with that realization, old memories resurfaced. Times when I stepped in quietly to help, and she bristled without explanation. Moments when she dismissed my efforts as unnecessary, only to claim credit for something similar later. Back then, I convinced myself it was just personality differences. But now, looking at the pattern stretched across years, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about the project I offered to cover. It was about history. Hers, mine, ours. I began seeing how deeply Melissa tied her worth to being the one who appeared most responsible, most present, most loyal. My quiet acts, the ones I didn't make a big deal about, must have felt like threats to that identity. And instead of acknowledging that fear, she reshaped my intentions to protect herself, realizing this didn't excuse the hurt, but it did explain why the narrative twisted so quickly and why she clung to it so tightly. A strange sadness washed over me as the truth settled. This conflict was never about me trying to help. It was about a long-standing void inside her that I kept stumbling into without knowing. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The weight of years of misunderstanding pressed in, but beneath it, something else stirred. A quiet clarity that told me I couldn't keep participating in the same cycle. That clarity built slowly, rising like a tide, preparing me for the moment when I would finally choose a different path, one that would carry me straight into the confrontation I had avoided for far too long. There came a moment when the weight of everything I had been carrying finally pressed me still. It wasn't dramatic or loud. It was a quiet understanding that if I didn't choose a different path now, I would spend the rest of my life repeating the same patterns that had exhausted me for years. That realization felt like a slow breath expanding in my chest, steady and undeniable. I knew I couldn't keep apologizing for things I hadn't done or bending myself into shapes that made other people more comfortable. So I drew a boundary, not with sharpness, but with clarity. I expressed what I could no longer take on and what I needed to step away from. My voice felt unfamiliar at first, steadier and more grounded than I expected. There was no anger behind it, just truth, and a kind of peace that surprised me. Honoring myself in that moment felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of walking on sand. The reactions came quickly. I sensed confusion from some, resistance from others, a quiet shock that I wasn't slipping back into the role they were used to, but their responses didn't rattle me the way they once would have. Instead, I felt a strange calm settling in, as if I had finally returned to myself after being away for too long. Standing there, holding firm to a boundary I should have set years ago, I realized something had shifted permanently. I couldn't unlearn this clarity, and I didn't want to. Whatever came next, whatever adjustments or tensions followed, I knew this was the turning point. This was the moment that would change the way I moved through my family, and more importantly, the way I held myself moving forward. In the days after I set that boundary, everything felt oddly quiet, not empty, just quieter than the constant noise I'd grown used to carrying. I noticed small shifts first. A few family members softened around the edges, almost cautious, as if they were trying to figure out this new version of me who no longer absorbed everything without question. Others kept their distance, holding on to old assumptions, unsure how to engage now that I wasn't playing the role they relied on. But for the first time in a long while, those reactions didn't dictate how I felt. I could sense my own center forming again, steady and unforced. I had space to breathe, to think, to reflect without bracing for someone else's disappointment. And in that space, I realized how much of my life had been shaped by expectations I never agreed to. Things weren't magically fixed, and I didn't expect them to be. The dynamics were still layered and imperfect, but internally, something had begun to settle. The heaviness eased, replaced by a quiet sense of peace that came from finally honoring myself. Still, even with that calm returning, I felt something lingering at the edges, a sense that the story wasn't done yet, that one more moment waited just ahead, carrying a kind of closure I hadn't anticipated. In the quiet that followed those first weeks of distance, I started noticing how differently I carried myself. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't waiting for the next misunderstanding to land. And then, almost effortlessly, a moment arrived that softened everything even more. It came from my dad, a small gesture, barely more than a passing acknowledgement, but it held something deeper. It told me he had seen more than he ever said, that he understood the weight I'd been carrying long before any of this unfolded. That simple recognition settled into me like warmth. It reminded me that healing doesn't always come from grand apologies. Sometimes it comes from being quietly witnessed. And in that moment, I realized I no longer needed anyone to validate the choices I had made. I felt steady on my own. With that clarity, I could finally see the larger meaning behind all of this, and I knew it was time to put it into words. Looking back on everything, I can see how much of my life I spent trying to hold a balance that was never really mine to keep. Stepping away from that role forced me to confront truths I had avoided for years, the ways old patterns shaped me, the weight of unspoken expectations, and the quiet toll of always being the steady one. But it also taught me something deeper, that outgrowing a version of yourself isn't a betrayal. It's a necessary kind of growing up. Setting that boundary didn't fix every relationship, and it didn't erase the hurt. What it did was give me space to stand in my own life with more honesty and less fear. I feel steadier now, more grounded in who I am and what I'm willing to carry. And as I reached this place of clarity, a gentle gratitude settled in. It feels like the right moment to share that with you, too. Thank you for spending this time with me. Sharing this story has helped me release pieces I didn't realize I was still carrying, and speaking it out loud has given me a little more room to breathe. If you've ever faced misunderstandings or had to set a boundary that felt heavier than it should have, I'd love to hear how you moved through it. Your stories matter just as much as mine. Feel free to share them in the comments. I read every one. And truly, thank you for listening and letting me be honest here.